These are some headlines describing Wisconsin in the past few years. 7 of the drunkest cities in America are all in one state. Wisconsin is home to 12 of the nation's top 20 drunkest cities. Wisconsin officially drunkest state in all measurable ways. Milwaukee is the drunkest city in America, and so on. It's quite an insane reputation to have, and it begs the question, what makes Wisconsin drink so heavily? Well, off the bat, it may not be this extreme in reality. I mean, these studies seem to rely a lot on self-reports of binge drinking, so there can be a few variables at play. But nevertheless, it's impossible to deny the drinking phenomenon that is Wisconsin. So to understand how they came to be such drinkers, we have to start from the beginning. Wisconsin has a long-standing cultural connection to beer and brewing, going back to some of the first American settlements there. The 1820s and 1830s saw a large number of immigrants coming to the Wisconsin territory. A large number of the first immigrants to the state were German, who brought with them knowledge of German brewing techniques and a strong sense of national pride that they associated with beer and brewing. The settlers found in Wisconsin rich soil and weather well suited to growing hops and barley. Lake Michigan provided both an ample supply of fresh water and shipping routes to have ingredients shipped in from the East Coast. It was easy to cut ice from the rivers and streams in the long winters, making it easier to store and condition the beer before the invention of refrigerators. By the 1840s and 1850s, Milwaukee had gained a reputation as a German boom town, attracting even more immigrants to the area. Some began to see it as a national center for German Catholicism, while other German freethinkers came after fleeing political persecution after a series of failed revolutions in Europe in 1848. Whatever the cause, Milwaukee's growing beer industry found itself flush with talent. Major German brewers like Pabst, Miller, Schultz, and Blatz came to prominence as the Industrial Revolution arrived in Wisconsin and started to industrialize their brewing processes with their eyes expanding nationwide. By the turn of the century, Milwaukee was leading the nation in beer production. It's worth noting that the rise of the Wisconsin beer industry didn't go unopposed. Around the same time the brewers in Milwaukee were beginning to modernize, a growing temperance movement started to take root. The debate over prohibition seemed to stem from the urban-rural divide. The growing German population saw the calls to restrict alcohol as an attack on their heritage, and many of the temperance movement's activities had a nativist flavor, focusing their attention on Catholics, the Irish, and German immigrants. In 1853, partially rallied by a speaking tour by P.T. Barnum decades before he founded his circus, the people of Wisconsin voted to outlaw beer in the state. It was a referendum, so actual prohibition would have to be passed by the legislature, which they did 2 years later, but the bill was vetoed by the governor to potentially not disappoint the large German population in Milwaukee. Although the temperance movement didn't prevail in the 1850s, prohibition eventually did come. Wisconsin was one of the first states to ratify the amendment in January 1919. It was a few months after the end of the First World War, and anti-German sentiment was still high, possibly dampening any opposition to prohibition. Wisconsin's journey navigating prohibition and its aftermath would end up shaping its relationship to drinking and alcohol for decades to come. The state had a way of finding loopholes in its own law. The 18th Amendment allowed for each state to draft its own law defining how it would enforce prohibition. Wisconsin passed a law defining liquor as anything above 2.5% alcohol by volume, far above the amount listed in the national law. That law was amended a year later to match the federal law, but ended up getting repealed 4 years before the end of prohibition, leaving the state with no enforcement law. At the ground level, brewers had different methods for trying to navigate prohibition. Some switched to making ice cream, cheese, or soda, while others tried brewing near beer, which had the alcohol content boiled away. But many of them just ended up bankrupt. The Wisconsin brewing industry peaked in 1914 with 132 breweries, but by the end of Prohibition, only 73 remained, and they had a lot of thirsty customers. 1 year after the repeal of Prohibition, the Tavern League of Wisconsin formed to represent the interests of bar owners throughout the state. Over the years, the Tavern League has become a key player in determining laws related to alcohol manufacture and consumption throughout Wisconsin, but we'll get to them later though. Because first, there's another post-prohibition phenomena that is vital to understanding the Badger State's relationship to alcohol, supper clubs, and their relationship to brandy. After Prohibition, former speakeasies and roadhouses used by bootleggers and rum runners converted to supper clubs. The evening restaurants, known for dining, drinking, and dancing in a relaxing atmosphere, had a boom after World War II. But in 1947, these new establishments faced a supply issue when President Truman shut down distilleries in the US for 60 days, so the grain could be diverted to countries in Europe that were still struggling to feed their people after the war. Some Wisconsin consumers suspected tavern owners and bartenders were pouring cheap liquor into expensive bottles. People started to distrust the industry. Distributors in Wisconsin were able to acquire an aging stockpile of 30,000 cases of Korbel brandy from California. From that point on, Wisconsin bargoers had confidence that they were getting quality booze if they ordered a drink made with brandy. The old-fashioned cocktail became a staple in the state's supper clubs, which were largely seen as family establishments. So eventually, the drink became something of a tradition, being passed from generation to generation. Wisconsin's demand for brandy is so high that some years it accounts for more than half of Korbel's overall sales. The brandy old-fashioned became so common in Wisconsin that in 2023, the state assembly passed a resolution naming it Wisconsin's official state cocktail. And yes, Wisconsin was also the first state to designate a state cocktail. Now that we have an understanding of the natural and historical landscapes of Wisconsin, it's time to look at the legal landscape. There are several factors that make alcohol easier to access in Wisconsin than anywhere else in the US. Possibly the most significant factor is the sheer number of places to get drunk. A 2022 analysis looked at which states in the US had the most bars. Wisconsin had over 2,700 bars total, putting it at number 4 on the list, behind New York, California, and Texas. That's not too surprising when considering the population of those states. The smallest of the three, New York, is more than 3 times the population of Wisconsin. The picture obviously changes though when you account for the population. In the list of states with the most bars per 100,000 people, Wisconsin comes in 3rd, just behind Montana and North Dakota, some of the least populated states in the country. With just under 6 million residents, Wisconsin is triple the population of those 2 states combined. Basically, when it comes to population, those states have a much lower bar to clear, while middle-of-the-pack Wisconsin is competing with the nation's heavyweights. If you look online for what people of Wisconsin think of this drinking culture, many say it's simply because there's nothing much else to do, especially during the long winters. But on a more serious note, one potential reason for the high number of outlets in Wisconsin is a lack of statewide regulation. Unlike many other states, which have shared city and state control of alcohol licensing, local municipalities handle the issuing of liquor licenses and are allowed to set their own limits to suit the needs of their communities. That also means any city or town is allowed to set no limit at all. In 2023, Wisconsin's Governor, Tony Evers, signed a bill overhauling the state's liquor laws. The new law created a division in the Department of Revenue to oversee the liquor industry in the state. Issuing liquor licenses will still be handled locally, but if a city or town has set and reached its limit for new licenses, the new law would allow prospective bar owners to go around them and apply for a license with the county. This will arguably make it even easier for the number of bars in Wisconsin to grow out of control. That brings us to the subject of influence, and one of the biggest names in the state when it comes to lobbying and the alcohol industry, the Tavern League of Wisconsin. As mentioned before, the Tavern League formed in 1935, right after the repeal of Prohibition, to represent the interests of bar owners in the state. The Tavern League spent years negotiating with lawmakers on the bill overhauling liquor laws in Wisconsin. The Tavern League has gained a bit of a reputation. A lot of ink has been spilled, for better or worse, about the hold this organization has over policymakers in the state. One analysis by a Wisconsin journalism nonprofit found the Tavern League spends about $230,000 per 2-year legislative session on average. But they are far from alone. In the past 10 years, the Wisconsin Beer Distributors Association has spent anywhere from $80,000 to $380,000 per legislative session. Molson Coors has been spending around $275,000 lobbying dollars since acquiring the Miller Brewing Company in 2016. And the Wisconsin Wine and Spirit Institute reported spending about the same in the past 2 sessions. Although the Tavern League may not be the highest spender in lobbying dollars, they can still be effective in pushing their agenda. The League's victories include removing drunk driving warnings from state road signs and extending bar hours. official lobbying efforts aside, some of the league's strategies can be hard to grasp. But it does seem clear that it's developed strong relationships with policymakers. The Tavern League's reputation is so widespread that when people don't have an explanation for a policy in Wisconsin, they often suspect the league is behind it. Whether it's liquor stores only staying open until 9 p.m., or Wisconsin lagging behind its neighbor states Illinois and Minnesota in legalizing pot, people look at the Tavern League, even though they never took a position or actively lobbied on either of those issues. For all the attention they get exerting influence for the benefit of bar owners, one other issue they have lobbied for successfully is state funding for their very own Safe Ride program, which offers free rides home to customers at participating bars. The level of sway the alcohol industry gets due to lobbying and influence is hard to measure, but there are certainly other ways lawmakers have used a light touch. Wisconsin has some of the lowest taxes on beer and wine in the country. Since Prohibition, the tax rate on beer has been raised just once, in 1969. It was raised from $1 a barrel to $2, which amounts to about 6 cents a gallon. Bars in Wisconsin are also allowed to serve minors, as long as a parent or guardian is with them. They aren't the only state with this rule, but for a state like Wisconsin, it certainly would go a long way toward normalizing alcohol consumption among the youth, and cementing it as part of the state's culture. And culture does go a long way to explaining this issue in more ways than one. The data seems to clearly indicate that Wisconsin residents outdrink the rest of the country to a ridiculous degree, but the reality is there is a lot of room for nuance. In nearly all cases, the metric used to establish a state's relative drunkenness has been the percent of the population who regularly binge drink. The most reliable data we have for binge drinking comes from the CDC's Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which relies on self-reporting. A state like Wisconsin, with its cultural connection to drinking and alcohol, is not going to have as much of a stigma associated with drinking than other states. Wisconsinites might be a little more willing to share how often and how much they drink. After all, the brewing industry in Wisconsin contributes $12 billion to the state's economy. It supports over 69,000 jobs across agriculture, manufacturing, retail, distribution, and the actual brewing of the beer. It pays over $3 billion a year in wages and benefits, and contributes $1.5 billion to the government in taxes. Why would any Wisconsin resident see anything wrong with that? Well, the thing is, it comes with a cost too. Remember how I said beer brings in $1.5 billion tax dollars? A 2006 study found that excess alcohol consumption costs the state about $4 billion a year. Roughly 2/3 of the costs come from low productivity. Add in medical costs and government services, and it amounts to a substantial negative impact to the state's economy. But here's what you might not expect. For all the attention it gets for its level of excessive drinkers, in the matters of costs to the state, Wisconsin is not an outlier. With an estimated population of 5.9 million people, Wisconsin is the 20th most populous state, solidly in the middle of the pack. And when you look at per capita costs for excessive drinking, it's right there at number 20. The cost to the state of excessive drinking is around $700 per person, which is right around the median. The rest of the data pans out pretty much as you'd expect. Large states like California and Texas have the highest total cost, but spread out across their populations, it evens out. Utah, being perhaps the driest state, has the lowest per capita cost for drunkenness. There is, however, one outlier that seems worth mentioning. The place with the highest per capita cost by a mile for its excessive drinking, and routinely Wisconsin's closest competitor for drunkest place in the union, Washington, D.C., overindulging cost the District of Columbia $966 million in the 2006 study. That may not seem like much compared to the billions other states were spending, but for DC's population, which was estimated to be less than 600,000 people at the time, it came out to about $1,600 a person, over 500 more than the next closest state. So what can we make of all this? Is Wisconsin as a state just able to hold its liquor? Does spending so much time around politicians drive people to drink? One more look at the data may give us an idea. Remember how 2/3 of Wisconsin's economic impact came from lost productivity? For DC, it accounts for 80%. One possible explanation is that as the seat of power for the United States, DC has a number of residents, both inside and outside of the government, that command a high salary. Missing a day of work to sleep off a hangover or for a hospital visit because of an accident or liver disease has the potential to have a higher economic cost than anywhere else in the country. So does this mean Wisconsin doesn't have a costly drinking problem? I'm not sure I'd go that far. $4 billion is not a drop in the bucket for any economy, and it is still one of the top 10 states for drunk driving. Wisconsin has some work to do, but the nuances in the data suggest that the rest of us could stand to look inward. Wisconsin is the drunkest state, makes for a clickable headline, but it doesn't help any of the other states deal with their own problems with alcohol. Wisconsin has 12.5 alcohol-related fatalities per 100,000 people. That is slightly above average, but nothing compared to New Mexico, which has the highest rate in the country at 34. Strangely, that's also one of the states with the fewest bars. Wisconsin actually has one of the lowest rates of death from alcohol poisoning. Every year, for 1 million people in Wisconsin, 6 die from alcohol poisoning, compared to Alaska with 46. So what do you think of all this? There's a lot of contrasting data in regard to just how bad Wisconsin has a drinking problem, but it's undoubtedly there. Are they the most drunk state in the US? Thank you for watching.